I'm Frank Fukuyama. I'm the Bernard Schwartz Professor of International Political Economy, and this will actually be the first event in the Bernard Schwartz Forum on Constructive Capitalism for this year. I'm invited to give a lot of talks about things that I'm working on at different universities, and it occurred to me that it would be nice to do this at SAIS as well, and since I run this forum, I get to control who speaks in it. I thought I'd invite myself, so here I am. This is, by the way, actually not going to be about Denmark. I'm writing this book on political development. I need a good title for it. For reasons that I'll shortly explain, I came up with this one about getting to Denmark, but I thought maybe what I would do is have a contest to see, after you've listened to a couple of these lectures, we'll have a contest to name the book. And I don't know what the prize will be, but surely somebody in this very bright group of students will be able to figure out a way to title what my project is. Let me just explain a little bit about the background of this. It really comes out of two sources. About 3 or 4 years ago, Sam Huntington asked me to write a new preface for his classic book, Political Order in Changing Societies. Those of you who have taken courses with me have probably had to read parts of this book. It was written in 1968, and it was probably the last big effort to write a general book about political development. And I would say that really there hasn't been a comparable effort. In a certain way, Huntington managed to destroy the whole field of modernization with that book, and no one's ever tried to put it back together again. And so it occurred to me in writing the preface that the book really needed to be updated in many ways. And so I thought, well, okay, since I had been a student of his, let's start with that. But another thing intervened in the meantime. I went on several trips to Melanesia on behalf of the World Bank, looking at governance problems. In international development, good governance and strong institutions has become the catchword at places like DFID and the World Bank and USAID. And this is where the Getting to Denmark problem comes in. Getting to Denmark was the title of a paper that was written by Michael Woolcock and Lant Pritchett, both social scientists at the World Bank, maybe about 10 years ago. And they said, well, okay, this is the problem, is that we have these countries like Papua New Guinea or Haiti or Afghanistan or Somalia that are poor, they're failed states, they don't have good government, they have a very high level of corruption, and we believe that there is this mythical place called Denmark, which is a country that doesn't have corruption, it's democratic, it's stable, it's got good institutions, it's participatory, it's rich. And what we want basically is to figure out how to get Somalia to be Denmark. So that's the Getting to Denmark issue. And needless to say, development agencies have had a terrifically difficult time in bringing this result about. And one of the reasons, I think, for this is that nobody understands actually how Denmark got to be Denmark. I've actually had a little experience of this because I've had a very nice visiting professorship at the University of Aarhus. So I actually have been to Denmark a few times in the last couple of years. And it does strike me that actually a lot of Danes don't know how Denmark got to be Denmark. In terms of very basic institutions, for example, Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands are tribal societies. They are organized into what anthropologists call segmentary lineages, in which descent is traced by the male line. In some of the coastal tribes, it's through the maternal line. But the primary loyalty is to a descent group, which is a group of perhaps 200-300 people. And one of the reasons that they don't have good governance in Papua New Guinea and the Solomons is that there's no concept of a social order of a state that's higher than the level of the tribe. And therefore, if you're elected to the parliament in either of those places, your first instinct isn't to say, well, what should we do for Papua New Guinea? Your first instinct is, how do I send resources back to my tribe? And outsiders, these well-meaning Australians and World Bank people, look upon this as corruption, but in fact it is actually perfectly natural behavior of people who operate within the framework of a tribal society. And so in watching these donor agencies struggle with this problem, it struck me, I began to wonder, how did anybody get out of this situation of moving from a kinship-based form of social organization to a modern state. And, let's not even talk about Denmark, but how did they even get to be, China or in the Han Dynasty or England in the 13th century? And so this prompted this current project that I'm working on, which is actually going to be a 2-volume effort to write a general account of political modernization or political development. I don't believe that you can write a theory of this for various reasons that we can get into. But the first volume is entirely historical, and it focuses on 3 components of political development. The first is the state itself. Where did the state come from? By state, I'm going to use Max Weber's definition. It's a monopoly of legitimate force over a defined territory that is able to enforce rules. Second component of political development is the development of the rule of law. And again, I think there's been a lot of confusion. In that lecture, I'm going to explain why I think a lot of economists have screwed up our understanding of what the rule of law means, because they associate it entirely with property rights and with contract enforcement. More properly, what the rule of law is the existence of a set of rules that reflect a very deep social consensus within the society that the current rulers of that society feel that they are bound to observe. And so while state building is all about the concentration of coercive power in a state, the rule of law is a set of institutions that limits the ability of the state to simply act arbitrarily. And the final component of political development is accountable government. By and large, in the modern world, we regard accountable government as democracy, elections, political contestation, so that you can remove your leaders if you think that they're screwing up or not doing what you want them to do. But that is not the only form of accountability. You can also have moral accountability. And one thing I'll explain when we talk about China is the fact that in a certain sense, there was a very strong tradition in China of accountability. It just wasn't procedural accountability through something like an election. It was really through princely education and the way that Chinese rulers were taught to regard their responsibilities. All right, so those are the 3 components. The one part of Huntington that I am taking away and taking to heart is his view that political development is its own subject. There was a big mass of what's now known as modernization theory that comes out of social theorists like Adam Smith, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, Tönnies, and so forth in the 19th century, all of whom looked at the phenomenon of modernization in Europe, political, social, and economic, and believed that this was a part, they were all components of one single process. And Huntington's basic insight was that they are not necessarily part of the same process, that they are related to each other, but political development follows its own logic and does not necessarily entail either economic or social development. And so it needs to be studied as a separate subject from the question of, let's say, economic growth. I'll get back to this. All right, so let me explain the plan of these 4 lectures. I'm starting at a very early point. I think one of the problems with Huntington's book is that he already presumed the existence of modern politics, political parties and states and so forth. And if you really want to understand where basic institutions came from, you have to rewind the clock really far. You don't even going back to the beginning of human history isn't sufficient, because I believe that there are biological foundations of human politics for which you need actually to go back to the pre-human precursors of human beings. And so that's the point at which we're going to start in this lecture. And actually, at the end of today, we're not even going to get up to the first state that emerged. We're not going to get beyond tribalism. In the second lecture, we're going to talk about state formation. The earliest modern state ever created by a human society, I believe, was that created by the Chinese already in the 3rd century BC. And one of the things I wanted to do in the book is to get away from the Eurocentric focus that is typical of a lot of the classical accounts of modernization. And so since the Chinese were the first to create the state, the question I'm going to raise is, well, how did the Chinese do it? And why did every other society diverge from the Chinese pattern? Why did every other society not end up like China? The second society I'm going to consider is India, so that'll be also in the second lecture. And also I'm going to look at state formation in the Muslim world, because they had a very different and very interesting strategy for getting beyond tribalism and kinship. Third lecture is going to be on the origins of the rule of law. That's mostly going to be a European story, but I'm going to talk about the rule of law in the Middle East as well, because this is also a society that had a very strong tradition of rule of law. And the last lecture is going to be about the rise of accountable government, and that's largely going to be a European story, where I'm going to talk about France, Spain, Hungary, Russia, and finally England, and why in some parts of the world you got the rise of political accountability in the form of representative parliamentary government in England, and why you got absolutism with no constraints on political power in a place like Russia. So that's the overall thing. So we're going to begin with the state of nature. As I said, I don't believe that you can give an account of human politics without looking past human beings in their present form and understanding the biological precursors that account for human sociability. The typical way in which this question was addressed by early modern liberal theorists, people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, was to talk about the state of nature. In Locke's second treatise, in Hobbes's Leviathan, in the Discourse on Human Equality of Rousseau, all of them speculated on what pre-human society, or before the emergence of society, what natural man was like. Now, it is really not clear that any of these philosophers believed that they were giving an empirical account of the development of human society, although if you read Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality, he actually quotes what passed for anthropological data, knowledge about the Caribs and other tribes that Europeans had discovered in the late 1800s. But they're all speculating about the grounds on which human political community emerges, and therefore the grounds on which legitimate and illegitimate forms of political organization take place. The differences, it's very hard to summarize these extremely deep and complex thinkers, but I think most people from even a casual knowledge of this trio of theorists recognize that there are certain landmark ideas that they represented. So Thomas Hobbes describes the state of nature as being a war of every man against every man, because people are driven by ambition, by greed, by the desire for glory, and they will fight each other and put their own lives at risk until there's a transition to a social contract by which every one of these individuals in the state of nature agrees to give up their right to take another person's life in return for the respect of their life. And if you think about the origins of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the American Constitution, the real predecessor of that is actually not John Locke, it's Thomas Hobbes. Locke had a much kinder, gentler view of this because he believed that the sovereign himself could threaten life and liberty, and therefore there was a right of rebellion which Hobbes didn't really allow for. Rousseau has a very different view from Hobbes with regard to the natural proclivity of man with regard to violence. Hobbes believes that human beings are violent by nature. Rousseau argues that violence was actually something that was the product of social evolution, that early man was actually isolated, peaceful, did not live in society, and therefore had no reason to compare himself. But the moment that he started saying, I'm better than you, this was the origin of both private property and also of human competition, and therefore society, in a sense, is the source of inequality and injustice. All right? Now, I don't want to get into political, the specific implications of those political theories, but I do want to point out that all three of these thinkers that are absolutely at the core of our Western liberal tradition, political tradition, all shared a common set of assumptions, which was that human beings in the state of nature were isolated individuals, and that there was at some point a transition to society by which these individuals agreed through some kind of a conscious process of social contracting to agree to live peacefully in a political society. Now, I say all of this by way of introduction because I think that we actually know a great deal more about the nature of the state of nature today than we did in the 17th and 18th centuries. That knowledge comes from a lot of different sources. It comes from cultural and social anthropology. It comes from archaeology. It comes from primatology. It comes from population genetics. It comes from evolutionary biology, which is the broad framework by which social evolution is understood, and in particular evolutionary psychology, which focuses on the development of the cognitive facilities that allow people to work together in groups. And I believe that if you look at the cumulative findings in those parts of the life sciences, there is one critical area in which these early state of nature theorists are all wrong, which is the premise of primordial individualism. That is to say, the positing of a period in human history in which people did not live in society, did not have primary attachments to social groups, but acted as isolated individuals. And then a related premise is that the transition to society was a rational act of calculation on the part of these isolated individuals. So in different ways, although they draw different conclusions, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau all begin from this individualist premise. And I think that everything that we know about the actual state of nature as it existed, even in terms of human precursors, the primates that were the precursors of human beings, suggest that that individualistic state of nature never, ever existed. There was never a pre-social period in human history. And in fact, Henry Maine, the great English legal scholar, was really the first to point this out already in the 1860s in his book, Ancient Law. He has a line, he says, "These two theories of Hobbes and Locke, which long divided the reflecting politicians of England into hostile camps, resemble each other strictly in their fundamental assumption of a non-historic, unverifiable condition of our race. Their authors differed as to the characteristics of the pre-social state and as to the nature of the abnormal action by which men lifted themselves out of it into that social organization with which we alone are acquainted, but they agreed in thinking that the great chasm separated man in his primitive condition from man in society." And that, Henry Maine argues, is completely false. There was never a pre-social period in human evolution. Now, how do we, well, and I would actually label this the Hobbesian fallacy. We'll come back to this at the end of the lecture, but in the first instance, the Hobbesian fallacy consists in the view that there was a period of primordial individualism. In fact, I think the truth of the matter is that individualism is socially created in the course of human history, that we end up being individualistic as a result of living in societies that promote individualism, but by nature we are not individualistic. By nature we are social creatures. Incidentally, this has a lot of relevance, to a lot of controversies in the contemporary social sciences, because modern neoclassical economics is founded on a premise of methodological individualism. Economists believe that you cannot explain the behavior of groups except by decomposing them into the individuals and the rational choices that individuals make. And therefore, every aggregate social group is the result of a game theoretic interaction among these rational individuals, and they don't take as a starting point the pre-existing norms that bind people together in groups. All right, so how do we know any of this? How do we know about what the primordial state of human nature was? There are several different sources from it. The most basic, if you go to virtually any sexually reproducing species, there is clear evidence of inbuilt altruism and social behavior in a whole host of, actually very simple organisms. The biologist that is most clearly associated with this view is the great biologist, English biologist William Hamilton, who developed the theory of kin selection or inclusive fitness. He argued that individuals do not want to preserve themselves as individual organisms necessarily. What they want to do is preserve their genes. They want to make sure that their genes get passed down into the future. And so the selfishness is really with regard to the ability to reproduce yourself in future generations. It's not the actual survival. So a mother will sacrifice herself for the sake of her children, because that's the most secure way of making sure that her genes get passed down. Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The Selfish Gene, which is a popularized view of basically this Hamiltonian theory of inclusive fitness. And it turns out that the general rule in evolutionary biology is that people, or not people, but animals are altruistic in proportion to the number of shared genes that the number of genes that they share. So full brothers and sisters, uncles and nephews, or uncles and nieces, mothers and their children all share 50% of their genes, and therefore their degree of altruism is going to be twice as large as first cousins who only share a quarter of their genes. And through various kinds of statistical studies, biologists have shown that this is a fairly invariant rule among a whole lot of different sexually reproducing species. There's also a principle of reciprocal altruism that is associated with the biologist Robert Trivers, in which non-related species actually show altruistic behavior. And in fact, there are certain species where, they're completely unrelated and they live in symbiotic relationships of social cooperation. So even before you get to primates, there's a fair amount of evidence that there is a genetic propensity in many species for social behavior. When you get to primates, however, you're in a whole different ball of wax. And it's worthwhile talking a little bit about what the primatologist Frans de Waal calls chimpanzee politics. Frans de Waal is a Dutch primatologist. He used to be the director of the zoo at Arnhem in the Netherlands, and he's now the head of the Yerkes Primatological Lab at Emory University in Atlanta. And he's written a whole series of very, I think, amusing and readable books about chimpanzee behavior. And Chimpanzee Politics is actually the title of one of these books. And this is based on both observation of chimps in Gombe, in Zaire, in the DRC, and in captive chimp colonies. Biologists believe that both human beings and contemporary chimpanzees are descended from a chimp-like ancestor approximately 5 million years ago. The two branches split off. Human beings went through a very rapid cognitive evolution. The chimps, it's postulated, evolved to a much lesser extent, and that to some degree contemporary chimpanzees are fairly close to the behavior of this common ancestor of both humans and chimpanzees. There are a number of really remarkable similarities between social organization among chimpanzees and among human beings. The biological anthropologist Richard Wrangham says the following: very few animals live in patrilineal male-bonded communities wherein females routinely reduce the risks of inbreeding by moving to neighboring groups to mate, and only 2 animal species are known to do so with a system of intense male-initiated territorial aggression, including lethal raiding into neighboring communities in search of vulnerable enemies to attack and kill. All of you who have seen these movies of really cute little chimpanzees don't realize that these are actually baby chimpanzees, that a full-grown chimpanzee is a really big, scary creature with extremely sharp, big teeth, and they routinely kill each other. And in fact, this has been observed in the wild, where groups of chimpanzees, male chimpanzees, will go out basically on aggressive expeditions to kill and eliminate rival gangs of chimpanzees that are at the fringes of their territory. And if you read some of the field reports of watching this behavior, it really looks like the Bloods and the Crips. There's no other way of describing it. What's very interesting is that Chimps, like human beings, organize themselves into dominance hierarchies. Chimps are different because you have both male and female hierarchies, whereas in primitive human communities, they tend to be revolve around men exclusively. They're similar also in the sense that, as in a band level or a tribal level society, leadership in a chimp colony is ascribed rather than inherited. That is to say, there are no chimp kings that become the alpha male simply because their father was king. You have to demonstrate certain leadership qualities in order to be granted alpha male status by your colony, which is actually very similar to the way that people become a big man in Papua New Guinea. It is not simply being the physically most dominant person in the colony. It really has to do with qualities that you would actually have to describe as leadership. It involves physical dominance, but it also involves something much closer to authority. De Waal gives this very interesting case of a chimp in the captive colony called Mama, who is an older female who is weaker than many of the young males that were competing for alpha male status. But he says the following about her: when tensions in the group reach their peak, the combatants always turn to her, that is to say, Mama, even the adult males. Many a time I have seen a major conflict between two males end up in her arms. Instead of resorting to physical violence, at the climax of the confrontation, the rivals run to Mama, screaming loudly. There are other chimp behaviors that suggest that they have a certain sense of justice. For example, when one chimp feels that he's been dissed by another chimp, a lot of times what he'll do is point to the other chimp and look at the other chimps in the colony and say, oh, look at him, look at him, look at what he did. That wasn't right. Of course, this is the ascribing of human motivations to animals, which routinely biological anthropologists are warned about. But when you read these accounts of Wrangham or Jane Goodell or De Waal, it does seem to me that it's very hard to believe that there's something much more complicated going on underneath the surface of this kind of primate behavior. I'll give you one final example. Embarrassment. Chimps apparently feel embarrassment. They also seem to have senses of humor. Consider this story. Yvonne was one of De Waal's graduate students observing the behavior of a young female chimp named Choco. Choco was becoming more and more mischievous, and it was time that she was checked. One day when Choco had taken the phone off the hook for the nth time, Yvonne gave her a good scolding while at the same time gripping her arm unusually tightly. The scolding seemed to have the desired effect on Choco, so Yvonne sat down on the sofa and started to read a book. She had forgotten the whole incident when suddenly Choco leapt onto her lap, threw her arms around Yvonne's neck, and gave her a typical chimpanzee kiss with open mouth, smack on the lips. In other words, Choco was embarrassed to have been caught and reprimanded for doing something naughty, and she wanted to make up to Yvonne because she evidently felt something that looks like human embarrassment, which is, if you think about what embarrassment is, it is the act of being caught up in or caught out in not following a norm that governs the routine behavior of the group. Now, the other important source of our knowledge of primordial human behavior really comes out of the cognitive neurosciences. John Locke's other great book, his treatise on human nature, developed the premise that the human mind, this is the famous tabula rasa, that human beings are not born with innate ideas, that every idea they have is simply the result of some experienced sensory perception that comes from the outside world after they are born. And there's a tremendous amount of research that indicates that that Lockean view of the tabula rasa is simply not right. It's true that people don't come into the world spouting quotations from Shakespeare, but on the other hand, it is fairly clear that they have certain innate facilities for solving problems, especially those related to social cooperation. In the 5 million years between the chimp-like ancestor and modern human beings, the volume of the brain tripled. it increased at an extraordinarily rapid rate in evolutionary terms. And the largest area of increase was the neocortex. This is the frontal lobes of the brain, which are less involved with basic emotions like fear, but more with the ability to calculate, with language, with the ability to solve problems of social cooperation. And there's a tremendous amount of, I think, more speculative work in evolutionary psychology as to what was it that was driving this extraordinarily rapid increase in the volume of human cognitive capacity. And the answer that most people have come up with is that human beings, right from the start, have had to solve basically what economists would call iterated prisoner's dilemma games. That is to say, in order to survive, if you're a group that's going out on a group aggression, you have to cooperate. Even to do things like hunting monkeys, chimps have to learn how to cooperate, but you have to know how to cooperate, whom to cooperate with, because not everybody is equally trustworthy. And therefore, the theory is that it was not actually the need to invent tools or deal with a difficult external environment, but the need to compete against other groups of primates that drove the evolution of human cognitive capacities, and particularly this ability to solve iterated prisoner's dilemma games. That is to say, to be able to remember essentially who screwed you in the past and who you therefore don't want to work with, or conversely, who was trustworthy and who will be a good cooperator in the future, because that ultimately is the basis of all forms of social cooperation. And there's a tremendous amount of evidence that the cognitive facilities for solving prisoner's dilemma games is not something that is learned after birth, that it's right there from the beginning. Again, the case of embarrassment is a good one. Embarrassment is something that children feel. I mean, as a parent myself, you know that the thing that your child fears the most is to be caught in a social situation where they're different from the group or they're not conforming to some kind of group norms, and nobody teaches them this. Absolutely nobody. The parents do not teach them this kind of norm conformity. And in fact, we have we have this condition that we label pathological, which is autism, which has to do with the inability or a dysfunction in this natural ability to put yourself in the position of another human being and to empathize, and therefore to be able to see yourself externally as if you are watching your own behavior from the perspective of another human being. But people have this naturally. It does not need to be taught to them. And I would say that in general, there are a number, and so when we say that human beings are born with certain inbred capacities for social cooperation, a lot of them are cognitive and rational in the sense that we have to be able to calculate whom we can trust and whom we should shun. But a lot of that social cooperation is also driven by certain emotional characteristics or responses, natural responses. In particular, the emotions of pride, anger, guilt, and shame that are all related to norm following in human social interaction. So you feel pride when you have actually conformed to a norm that is esteemed in your community. You feel anger when those norms are violated. And in fact, you have moralistic aggression where people feel angry about norms that are broken, even when it doesn't matter who the object is, even when the person, you obviously get mad when somebody is aggressive towards you, but people get mad when people are aggressive towards a third party in whom they have no interest, but it's simply the fact that they've broken the norm. Shame and guilt, again, I think are natural characteristics that have to do with your violation of certain norms. And all of this is something that every human being that again is not born with a pathological condition, is not a sociopath, has by nature, and it is the foundation of basic forms of cooperation. All right, the next interesting thing has to do with evolution and migration. We know actually a lot about where human beings came from, and we know this through population genetics. This is all stuff that's really happened in the last 10 to 15 years. It is possible to trace the movements of early human beings even before recorded history, either through the Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA they were originally bacteria that were trapped inside cells and then became very important to the generation of energy within a cell. They have their own DNA that's not related to the normal chromosomal complement that's in the nucleus of every cell. They are handed down from mother to daughter in an unbroken line without any influence on the father, and population geneticists can actually follow the movement of human populations based on gradual accumulations of miscopied points in the mitochondrial DNA. Same thing is true of the Y chromosome. Only males have the Y chromosome. It's passed down exclusively, therefore, through males. And then, again, by counting changes, accumulated mistakes in replication, over time, you can say that this particular group of human beings in, let's say, Peru was descended from this particular group in Siberia, but could not have been descended from another group in East Africa. And as a result of this, they now actually have fairly impressive mappings of early human movement. And so I think everybody is fairly familiar with the idea that the human species really got its start in Africa. There were at least two major migrations of human beings out of Africa. The first had to do with archaic human beings that left as many as 300 to 400,000 years ago, got all the way up into Europe. So the predecessors of the famous Neanderthals were from this group of archaic human beings. But virtually every human community outside of those that stayed in Africa are descended from a separate second migration that took place approximately 50,000 years ago. The population geneticists have located they believe that they've located the point. They think that a single group of individuals crossed over the Straits of Hormuz about 50,000 years ago. They then propagated across the Middle East, across Southeast Asia, through Sunda and Sahul, which were at that point, because of a lot of water being locked up in glaciers at that period, you could actually walk from Southeast Asia to Papua New Guinea, so that's how they got to present-day Melanesia. So one group, and they did this in an extraordinarily quick amount of time, by 46,000 years ago, so it was basically a period of 4,000 years. It took them to get from Africa, from their exit point in Africa, all the way to Southeast Asia and to Melanesia. And incidentally, there's some speculation. I mean, nobody knows what the size of that group is, but because of the genetic uniformity of the groups that were propagated after that initial exit out, or that exit out of Africa, there's some speculation the group may have been as few as 150 individuals, meaning that basically, 99% of the world's population is descended from this very small group of individuals. All right, so that group went another way. Another group went out to the northeast, up through Central Asia and into China. They crossed over the Bering Sea, again in a period when you could just walk across the Bering Strait. They got all the way to southern Chile by 12,000 years ago. The earliest human remains have been dated to 12,000 years ago, all the way at the southern tip of Chile. So again, they traveled an extraordinary distance in a relatively short period of time. Another group left to the northwest, again up through the Middle East and Central Asia, and then into Europe, where they encountered the descendants of the archaic human beings like the Neanderthals, and then wiped them out in a in the period of some centuries or maybe millennia, because at that point you had what are known as behaviorally modern human beings that had the full suite of both cognitive and motor capacities for basically what people would argue was a superior form of social organization, and therefore they could organize better to fight all of, not just the non-human species they encountered, but all of the earlier human ones as well. War is quite important to this. The Rousseauian idea that these early human beings were somehow peaceful, I think, has been disproven by a fair amount of evidence. I'll get back to that. I'll get back to that in a moment. So the biological foundations of politics, I would say, are the following. I mean, what do we know about the state of nature? we know that, and a lot of blood has been spilled over the nature versus nurture question. The pendulum has swung back very heavily in favor of nature over the last 50 years. In the middle of the 20th century, you couldn't get a respectable social scientist to say that human nature existed. This was kind of the heyday of social constructionism, where everybody would say, well, if human beings behave in a certain way, it's only because they've been taught by their society to behave in that fashion. But I think as a result of the cumulative knowledge in all of these different domains, it's become fairly clear that there is such a thing as human nature, that human beings are born with a certain suite of cognitive facilities and certain emotional responses and certain abilities to deal with social situations, which is why the political structures that they then go on to create are actually pretty similar all over the world. Some of those have to do with kin selection, the preference for relatives, which is a universal constant in every human society, the facility for developing principles of reciprocity, which is the basis of human morality. Again, that's pretty much invariant across human societies. Human beings by nature come up with mental models of how the world works. In primitive societies, these tend to be religious models. That is to say, there's a big salamander up in the sky and that's making the rain fall, and if you propitiate the salamander, you'll get rain and this sort of thing. I mean, you may laugh at this, but the fact of the matter is that there's almost no religious belief that is either verifiable or falsifiable. We actually don't know that there isn't a salamander that's actually just disguising himself and pretending to operate by the laws of physics, but, have both what anthropologists call general evolution, which is the general impact of running into the natural environment of human beings, and then specific evolution, which is human beings fanning out into all these particular environmental niches, coming up with different ideas, different mental models, and then diverging as societies into different kinds of cultural groups. Well, I am running late, so we're going to go over the next stage of evolution quickly, because the whole point of my giving this lecture is to get questions and feedback. So let me try to speed things up. Many people believe, back up a little bit, the very notion that there's such a thing as social evolution was, again, very controversial. There's a long background to this, because the earliest anthropologists, people like Lewis Henry Morgan or Edward Tyler, who developed evolutionary theories back in the late 19th century, were picked up by people like Karl Marx. Friedrich Engels, Marx's collaborator, actually read Lewis Henry Morgan, that had written a very, he was one of the founders of modern anthropology. He wrote extensively on the tribal organization of indigenous peoples in North America. Engels read this book, and his book on property and the early family was derived from his reading of Edward Morgan. But unfortunately, this was a period of social Darwinism in which there was a lot of theorizing that the existing hierarchy of societies, with white Europeans at the top and black Africans at the bottom, represented a natural evolutionary process, and that the ones at the top of the current hierarchy were there because they were endowed by nature with better genes and better abilities. And a lot of 20th century anthropology, I think, was really a reaction to the racist implications of social Darwinism. The leader of this was a great anthropologist at Columbia University, Franz Boas, who did this very famous study of head sizes of immigrant children, because in the anti-immigration debate in the early 1920s, a lot of nativists would argue that immigrants were stupider, basically, than native-born white Americans, because their heads were smaller. And Boas simply did this study in which he measured head sizes, when immigrants were fed an American diet, and it turned out that there was no difference, really. And it turns out some of them were actually smarter than the native-born ones when exposed to the right environmental circumstances. And so this led to a very long period in cultural anthropology where it was really verboten to talk about evolution, but in fact, the plain fact of the matter is that social evolution exists. And so you then have the recreation of a body of evolutionary theory by people like Marshall Salins or Morton Freed or Leslie White, Julian Stewart, that then tried to describe or at least categorize the different stages. So the ones that we're familiar with, some of them are based on tools like Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. Some of them are based on economic relations of production, so hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies to industrial ones. The one that I think is the most relevant for politics is one that's based on forms of social organization. So the earliest form of social organization would be what's called a family or band level. The next level above that is tribal organization. Above that is a chiefdom, and then you finally have the state. And as I said, we're not even going to get to the state in this lecture, so we're kind of working our way forward in time. Many people think that tribal organization is actually a natural form of human social organization, and it is not. As far as we can tell, hunter-gatherer societies, for the most part, did not live in tribal organizations. They lived in much smaller bands of relatives, basically, of maybe 30, 40 people, looking much more like a chimp colony or a group of chimpanzees, rather than the more complex forms of kinship organization in tribal societies. But at a certain point in time, particularly coincident with the development of agriculture approximately 10,000 years ago, band-level societies began organizing themselves in a much more complex form based on descent groups. Now, I can go through a very quick primer on basic social anthropology. It's important because people, when they confront tribes in Anbar province, they kind of have this vague notion of what tribal organization is like, but they don't really, have any real anthropological background. But, the basic principle, I think, first of all, is in order to get a segmented tribal society, you have to have a principle of descent and inheritance that is what anthropologists call unilineal, meaning it has to go exclusively either through the mother or through the father. Probably 98% of all tribal societies in the world are what's called agnatic or patrilineal, meaning that inheritance goes exclusively through males, although under certain environmental circumstances you have matrilineal societies in which property is inherited through the mother's line. That's not the same as a matriarchal society, because even in a matrilineal society, power still largely resides with men. But in an agnatic society, and it comes from it comes from the Latin term because Roman society was organized agnatically. You only trace your descent through male relatives. If a woman marries into an agnatic society, she basically has to cut all of her ties with her birth family, and she gets status in the male family only as a result of producing another male heir. And at that point, she's accepted as part of the husband's lineage, and then she has a place in the social hierarchy. And it means that if you actually don't produce the male heir, you're in a certain amount of trouble in that kind of society. But if you think about it, you can't get a tribal society if you have bilateral inheritance. If a child is equally related to both the mother's side and the father's side, you can't tell what tribe you're in because your father and mother come from different tribes and you're equally related to both of them. So in order to have a tribal society, you have to have a principle of unilineal inheritance, as I said, mostly on the father's side. And the way these societies are organized is around descent from a common ancestor. It can be as little as a couple of generations ago. Sometimes in China, they trace their lineages all the way back, 7, 8, 9, 10 generations, which makes the lineages incorporate, thousands of individuals. And indeed, in contemporary southern China, in Guangdong and Fujian, you still have lineages where the entire village will have the same surname of Deng, and they all believe that they're descended from a common ancestor many generations ago. The classic study of these segmentary societies is Edward Evans Pritchard's study of the Nuer, which was one of the most kind of pristine and classic forms of segmentary lineage organized societies anywhere in the world. And what makes a segmentary lineage interesting is that the segments, these descent groups, replicate themselves at all different levels of aggregation. So Evans Pritchard says, for example, and this is something that I don't know whether anthropology students still read Evans Pritchard, but certainly there was at least a good couple of generations for whom this was the Bible. He says the following of the New Era: each segment is itself segmented, and there's opposition between its parts. Members of any segment unite for war against adjacent segments of the same order, and unite with these adjacent segments against larger societies. The New Era themselves state this structural principle clearly in the expression of their political values. Thus they say that if the Leng tertiary section of the Lu tribe fights the Nyarquak tertiary section, and in fact there's been a long feud between them, the villages which compose each section will combine to fight. But if there's a quarrel between the Nyarquak tertiary section and the Rumjok secondary section, as has occurred recently over water rights at Fading, Leng and Nyarquak will unite against their common enemy. So it's a little bit, it's a version of that Arab saying, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my cousin against my, the next tribe, and so on and so forth. And it means that in tribal societies, you can aggregate collective action very quickly on a large scale simply by uniting tribal segments at higher and higher levels. And in human history, you have a lot of pastoral nomads that were organized on this tribal basis that created incredible military machines based on their ability to mobilize tribal segments at the drop of a hat for purposes of predation or so forth. Now, I'm saying all of this because this is an important backdrop to next week's lecture on the origin of the state, because property, justice, and war are all very different in a tribal society than they are in a state-level society. Let's begin with property. One of the big problems in Papua New Guinea is that 98% of the land area on that island is locked up in what are called customary property rights. And again, this is an area where I think contemporary economists have really screwed up our understanding of the origins of private property. As you probably have guessed from taking economics courses, modern economists think that property rights, modern property rights, are extremely important for development. And I think a lot of economists have this idea that either you have anarchy, or you have communism, or you have modern American property rights, that those are kind of the three variants that are out there. Modern property rights being individual and completely alienable at the will of the individual, what the Germans called freies Eigentum. The problem is that most property in most of human history fell into neither of those three categories. It was customary, meaning that property was held in lineage organizations, in these complicated kinship groups. And in a kinship group in Papua New Guinea, you can actually, a nuclear family can own a particular piece of property, but it will be severely entailed by that family's relations to cousins, to more distant kinsmen in the descent group, and therefore the alienability of that property is not, is very limited by the social conditions of the lineage. And that is why when a developer goes to Melanesia and wants to set up a palm oil agribusiness or a mining concession, that foreign investor has to deal with literally thousands of individual property owners, each of which have a veto on the alienability of the lineage's common property. And this was the situation of most private property. All right. Second thing, Douglas North has this nice phrase that only an economist could write. I'm sorry to keep dumping on economists, but in the course of writing this book, it really struck me at how ahistorical a lot of contemporary economic analysis is. But at one point in one of Douglas North's writings, he says, property rights developed because there was a demand for property rights. There's an old joke about an economist is walking down the street with his graduate student, and there's a $100 bill lying on the ground, and the student says, oh, look, there's a $100 bill, and the economist says, no, it's not there. And the student says, why isn't it there? And he says, well, if it were lying there, someone would have picked it up already. So in other words, there's a kind of presumption in economics that if there's an economic incentive to do something, then someone will do it. And similarly with property rights, there's this postulation that property rights came into existence because it was in somebody's interest to create property rights. The great historical anthropologist Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges, a French writer of the 19th century, wrote about the origins of property in Greece and Rome. Greek and Roman society were organized into agnatic lineages. And he said the origin of private property is actually religious. In a descent-based society, you worship your ancestors, and you bury your ancestors on your piece of property. And the Greeks and Romans believed that the spirit of the ancestor actually physically resided in the ground in which they were buried. And the origin of private property came about because the kin group could not alienate that property because their ancestors would get angry about it. And therefore you had private property, but you had private property that was not alienable in a market, based exchange thing. And I will tell you that that is the situation in the Solomons or PNG right now. People will not give up their property to a palm oil concession because they'll say that is where the grave of my ancestors are. And if your ancestors are living for you and able to punish you for bad behavior, whatever incentive the foreign investor can offer you is not going to be good enough. And it leads to this concept that's common in all agnatically organized societies in China, India, and so forth, that the Chinese describe as the rope of descent, that you are related both to all of your ancestors that preceded you, but also to all of your future descendants. And if your future descendants are not able to take care of you and to worship your spirit, then you are going to be in trouble. And if you break that rope of descent by not having children or by alienating the property on which your ancestor is buried, you're going to then suffer in the afterlife because you will not have descendants who will similarly honor you. And so the motives for private property in the first instance are completely, by this account, non-economic. Law and justice, I'm going to have to, in fact, maybe let me take this up in the next lecture, because essentially law and justice in a tribal society is basically based on revenge and the control of revenge, because there's no third-party state that is able to adjudicate disputes and enforce laws. And so basically law within a tribal society is a little bit like international relations today. It's all self-help. And so the strong can take care of themselves and they can negotiate agreements with other strong people, but there's no third party that's going to intervene like the United Nations and knock heads if people really get out of line. Finally, warfare. This is what I will conclude with. The reason that you evolve from a band level to a tribal level society is war. Tribal level societies are able to deploy much more striking military power than a band level society. Again, there is this quaint Rousseauian view among an earlier generation of anthropologists that maintain that early human beings were really peaceful. Lawrence Keeley and Stephen LeBlanc, and among others, have done studies in which they have counted evidence of conflict in early human societies, and it proves that actually the level of violence since hunter-gatherer days has actually come down. For example, if you look at the Kung San in the Kalahari Desert or the Eskimos, which are some of the few surviving hunter-gatherer societies, their rate of homicide per inhabitant is something like 4 times that of the United States today. So if you think we haven't made any progress with regard to the control of violence, you're actually not paying attention to a lot of the historical data. The other nice theory is that primitive peoples were ecologically better attuned to their environments, but it turns out that all of the megafauna in every part of the world, all of the mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers and mastodons and giant emus and so forth, the moment that human beings entered their territory, they're gone. They're just gone and extinct. And this all happened 10, 20,000 years ago. All right, so the final thought I'll leave you with is about violence and human progress. And unfortunately, this is one of the themes in this book. There's this big left-right argument over whether people are basically cooperative or competitive. And the right likes to think that human beings are competitive, and the left likes to think we're nice and cuddly and cooperative, and we like to work with each other. But I believe that if you think about human political evolution and trace this all the way back to the pre-human precursors of mankind, this chimp-like ancestor, you will see that cooperation and competition are absolutely intertwined and cannot be separated from one another. Human beings learn to cooperate because they have to compete with other groups of human beings. Hobbes's war of all against all was not a war of individuals against other individuals. It was a war of human groups against other human groups, and without the pressure of that kind of military competition, of a competition involving violence, you would not have had the transition from a band-level society to a tribal society. As we will see next week in talking about China and India, without military competition, you would not have had the transition from a tribal-level society to a state-level society. And so, in a certain sense, this is kind of the tragic, one of the tragic lessons of watching social, human social evolution, that the things that we prize most, like morality, peacefulness, willing to respect the rights of others, are actually forged in a crucible of larger forms of competition. And the second aspect of the Hobbesian fallacy is that there was ever an exit out of the state of nature. We have never exited the state of nature. All we've done is aggregated social organization to higher and higher levels where we can control violence at a given level. So right now it's at the level of the nation state, not at the level of the tribe or the band or whatever, but we still are in the state of nature. This is, I guess, what you learn in your IR theory courses, but we're still in a state of nature with regard to other human societies. So the next lecture is actually, we're going to get into real politics, and we're going to talk about the origin of the state. So as I said, I really want to get reactions, comments. We are running a little bit late, but if you've got time, I'm happy to stay here and field any questions. Thank you. All perfect. Yes, please.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I want to know why the economists, I'm a political scientist too, I want to know why the economists are wrong about property rights, not in terms of your point. I've done a lot of work in Papua New Guinea, and you're quite right. They're not about to abandon their property for economic motivations. But the other point that economists make, and economists in Australia who work on P&G make this all the time, which is until there are secure property rights, the country will never develop. And there's this huge push for that reason, not for reasons of economic theory, but for practical development reasons. Are you saying they're wrong as well?
No, I think that that's absolutely right. So the question is, how are you going to make a transition from customary property rights to modern property rights? One of the issues I'm going to explore in one of the later lectures is whether any human society has ever made that transition without violence. It's a very difficult thing, because if you think about the stakes that are involved in customary property, the ancestors and the religion and the embeddedness in kinship networks, it's very hard to understand how people would voluntarily exchange those, even for the economic benefits of living in a modern, high productivity society. And I think, again, one of the tragic characteristics of human social evolution is that de facto, in most of the places where you've made that transition, it's been by violence. We'll talk about Africa in this regard, at a later point, but Africa is a place, about half of Africa before colonialism was stateless, in which property was held in these customary arrangements, and, essentially a lot of people were either fraudulently or violently dispossessed of these customary rights in order to create modern alienable individual property rights, and that's a kind of sad fact of history. Yes?
My name is Jim Bruton. I'm a SAIS grad, and I want to take what I inferred from your comments and ask you if I got it right. And what I'm referring to in particular, there's a big conflict between what we inherit generically, what's natural, and what we learn socially. And we know, and I agree with what you said about the things that get passed on. There are things, we're afraid of snakes, and that's not something our parents teach us. But and we have many other reactions. But what I wanted to ask is, do you distinguish, or how do you distinguish between the mechanisms of, for lack of a better word, culture on one hand, and the content of culture on the other, though you didn't use these terms? Example, people may have a religious disposition when they're born, or
Yeah.
as they grow up. But that doesn't mean that they are
Yeah.
automatically inclined to be what their parents are.
You know, I think the archetype for thinking about that is human language. You know, many, many years ago, before Noam Chomsky got into, you know, being the inspiration for Hugo Chavez, he was a really great linguist. And, you know, he developed, you know, this theory about deep structures in human language. So anyone that's watched a child grow up knows that, you know, they've got this facility. They just pick up words by repeating, you know, things that their parents have said. And so the faculty for language is absolutely hardwired into every human being, but the actual content of the language that they learn depends on the language that their families or their neighbors speak. And so, you know, I think the theorizing is that with many human social, you know, that humans don't have specific instincts that say, okay, go pick up nuts in this area and you know, bury them over here. What they have, rather, are these generic facilities like the ability to speak a language, whose content is then filled in by the cultural environment into which they're born.
You can also take questions from Bologna as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting presentation, and enjoyed very much the diverse sources that you drew upon. But I also think that you know, sort of the lessons that one drew about human nature could have also been, say, derived from a reading of Aristotle's Politics. So my question is, what is the unique thing that one gets from, say, a study of evolutionary biology? What do we know that we did not know previous, or that we could not have known from, say, those
Well,
sources?
okay, you know, as a matter of fact, I think that Aristotle, when compared to Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau, is actually more accurate in his description of human nature, because he says that man is a political animal by nature that's designed to live in cities, that in a sense only flourishes within a political community, and he does not believe in primordial individualism. And so one thing I think that modern biology can tell you is that Aristotle was right in a way that Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau were wrong. Simple as that.
Bologna? If you just speak in the mic up front, it'll come over. Yeah, here you go. She should come over. Technological blip.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
There we go.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Washington. Bologna says hello.
Hi.
My question is related to religion, and I want to, first of all, I should probably thank you for the talk, but in this year of religion, can you touch on what role religion plays at the level of band and tribe, or is that something that's related to higher structures within your talk?
Yeah, no, that's, I will get into it further in the discussion next week. As I said, at band and tribe level societies, the primary form of spiritualism tends to be ancestor worship, given that that's the way that society is structured. At a certain point, tribal societies, you know, make a transition into worshiping God. You know, the problem with ancestor worship is it doesn't create the basis for collective action at a level higher than the kinship group, because you got your ancestors, I got my ancestors, I don't worship your ancestors, and therefore they have no hold on me. And the one thing you get with the first invention of polytheistic religion, like that of the Greeks and Romans, that was the next stage in their evolution after this ancestor-based religion, was all of a sudden Jupiter and Juno could be worshipped by everybody in the Roman ethnos, you know, not simply the ones that were they all claimed to be descended from Jupiter and Juno, but in fact they actually weren't related to each other. And so religion then provides a much broader scope for collective action, and then when you get to monotheistic religions, you get an even greater scope, because they claim to be, you know, they claim universal jurisdiction. And so all of a sudden, you know, with the rise of Judaism, well, Judaism is a little bit different because of the contractual nature of the relationship of God and the Jewish people, but certainly when you get to proselytizing religions like Christianity and Islam, the scope for collective action is almost universal because nobody is excluded from that religious community. This is going to be very important when we get to the question of the rule of law, because in my view, the real origin of the rule of law lies in the existence of religion, and the Chinese never had anything higher than ancestor worship. It's one of the great mysteries is how they created this extremely impressive civilization, actually without getting beyond that level of religious evolution, but it also meant that they didn't have a body of universally applicable religious doctrine that could serve as a basis for law. Ken, yeah.
Just one word to a provocative lecture, homosexuality. And I was thinking of, for one, of sex selection abortions that inevitably favor males.
You know, there is actually in evolutionary psychology a big literature on why homosexuality survives, because there's a lot of evidence that it is both environmentally stimulated but also has a clear genetic basis, and this is even on the level of neurophysiology. And so the question is, why would something that seems to be so anti-reproductive why did it not wipe itself out earlier? I am not an expert in this area, but there are various theories that somehow it's linked to the survival chances of the mother, but I don't know. Yeah.
I'd like to get back to something that you spoke of at the beginning of the lecture, which is the relationship between Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal man. Do you believe, does the evidence suggest that this was a competitive and cooperative event, or was it more like a genocidal event? In other words, and it's important on a grand scale, because if it was both a competitive and cooperative event and they interbred and blended to a homogeneous state, then that would suggest that we don't need to go out and just commit genocide in order to establish our...
Yeah, well, unfortunately, you can find plenty of other cases of genocide way beyond the Neanderthals, the end of the Neanderthals. Somebody else in the audience may actually know the answer to this. I mean, there was speculation that behaviorally modern humans and Neanderthals actually did interbreed for some period. My understanding is that there's no physical evidence that this actually happened. And it wasn't so much genocide. Genocide is kind of a modern thing where you have a state that can actually wipe out an entire people, quickly. What it really was is, band by band, modern human beings displacing archaic human beings from one habitat after another, to the point where the last one finally died over a period of, perhaps several thousand years. We will unfortunately see many other cases, where one society is basically wiped out by another society because it's got a superior form of social organization. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Fukuyama, for this wonderful lecture. My name is Isabella, and I have a comment/question. Coming back to the idea that Rousseau puts out about the noble savage versus Hobbes' idea about human beings being belligerent in the state of nature, is it possible that perhaps both exist and they coexist, and the reason why a lot of the political changes took place are only because of the dominance of the belligerent kind of human being? Could you please comment on that?
Well, as I said, I think conceptually it's actually, it's hard to separate the belligerents from the peaceful side. In Book 1 of Plato's Republic, there's this very cynical character named Thrasymachus who says, well, they're all discussing what is justice, and they all come up with these very high-minded views of what justice is, and Thrasymachus says, no, justice is just the advantage of the stronger. It's whatever the stronger says is just, so might makes right, basically. And Socrates' answer to this is, well, but what determines the justice among a band of robbers? Like, even if you say the purpose of, your purpose in life is to steal from other people, the robbers actually have to have some rules of justice among themselves if they're going to perpetrate their robberies successfully. And I think that, you know, there's actually a lot of evolutionary game theory that's quite interesting. There's this hawk and dove game in which you have a mixed population of agents that are predisposed to be cooperative and agents that are predisposed to be predatory. And neither one, you know, when you play the game iteratively, it turns out that neither population, neither the hawks nor the doves predominate, but because they always live in some kind of a rough balance. If everybody in the society is hawkish, they'll all kill each other eventually, because the individual hawks will have no basis for cooperating with any other hawk, you know, and eventually they will all exterminate one another. Similarly, if everyone is dovish, all you have to do is introduce one hawk into the population and they're all gone. You know, this is why Mormons are particularly susceptible to Ponzi schemes and other kinds of fraud, because they're very trusting and, you know, they abide by rules, but the moment you introduce, you know, someone that doesn't, they take, you know, tremendous advantage. And so what the evolutionary game theory tends to tell you is that in any population, you will get a mixture of both cooperative and kind of aggressive, you know, more selfish types of individuals. And you cannot have a successful society based exclusively on one or the other. If you don't have both cooperation, if you don't have cooperation, you can't compete. But if you have no, you know, competition, you know, you also are vulnerable.
You want to go ahead at Bologna?
Excellent. My name is Francesco Anesi, and I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Cambridge. Thanks a lot for the lecture. And with my question, I don't want to demonstrate that my personal biological evolution just stopped after the first 5 minutes of the seminar. But I would like to ask you a question regarding the title of the lectures. More precisely, I mean, I find it very challenging to follow you in your description about biology and about a non-Eurocentric view of the world and of biological evolution. But my question about the title is Getting to Denmark, in the sense that to a certain extent there is it's a contradiction in terms of the substance of the lecture. To a certain extent, I mean, you can say that, you know, I don't have problem with Denmark or with mythical states, but the idea of getting to Denmark is to a certain extent unidirectional or unilinear, you would say, I mean, according to the terminology that you teach us. And mostly, I mean, you're using the example of a European state for a non-Eurocentric view of the world. On the side of, if I were a development practitioner, I would say that Sudan doesn't need to get to Denmark. I mean, Bulgaria probably, I mean, will be much more than sufficient. So I'm not too aware that I fully understood the idea of getting to Denmark or that. I mean, I don't want to dissuade you, I mean, with the title, mostly because I don't have anything to persuade you with. But, I mean, if you could explain and elaborate still just a bit on the idea of either the book or the title of the lecture itself, I would be very grateful. Thanks.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, you come up with a better title and I'll consider it, because I realize that there are real limitations in that particular one. As you'll see in the subsequent 3 lectures, there are 3 components to political development. So there's the state itself, there's rule of law, and there's accountability, political accountability. Not every society has all of those. Some don't have states, some don't have accountability, some don't have rule of law. They've got them in different mixtures. You don't necessarily have to make a normative judgment as to which combination of those 3 aspects is right. However, I will say that if you, for example, have a powerfully developed state with no rule of law and no accountability, what you have is a more perfect tyranny. And as we'll see in the case of Chinese development, you know, that's really what the Chinese had. I mean, they developed a system of state centralization that was extremely modern, bureaucratic, efficient, and extremely tyrannical. You know, I'm saying, you know, if you want to live in that kind of society, fine. You would have had it 2,300 years ago. But there are other components of political institutions that people, find valuable. You don't have to accept, the normative implications that, it's best to live in a society that's got all three of these things: a state, rule of law, and accountability. That's my personal preference, but you can get off the boat anywhere you want, in a certain sense.
I think we're going to have one more question, and it looks like it's going to come from Bologna.
Yeah, got it. Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very, very interesting. In the talk, you mentioned that the idea that we never exited from the stage of nature, and we just evolved to a higher level of organization. And you mentioned that it was from the tribal level to the nation. And do you see the possibility of this evolution going up to the level of something that would embrace the entire humankind? Or is there, do you think, an evolutionary need for us to define us versus the other?
Well, short answer to your question is not in my lifetime do I think this is going to happen. I think there's a need, this whole discussion of global public goods points to the fact that there are certain common problems that everybody on Earth has, global warming or disease, control or prevention of nuclear war. There's all sorts of things like that for which you need cooperation. And as I said, we have not solved this Hobbesian dilemma. We've simply aggregated violence up to the level where it's deployed now by really powerful, political organizations. But the potential for cataclysmic violence is still there in the system. The more interesting philosophical question is whether we would actually want to solve this problem, because if competition, violent competition, is as important for, long-term human viability of societies as would seem to be the case, would you want to live in a society that only had peace and prosperity with no competitive pressures on it whatsoever? But I think as a practical matter, we're so far from there, and I think that the obstacles to getting there are so great that I don't lose a lot of sleep about whether it'll happen anytime soon. All right, thank you.